Thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview with us. The idea is really to sort of um, get some discuss some of the highlights of your paper. By the way, I read your paper with great pleasure and joy, and it really, really is a fascinating piece of work. So, yeah, so I guess I'll start off with the first question, which is which is regarding the central question you try to address in the paper and your answer to it.
Well, the question, you start with a question and then you finish with a different question. Research always looks like that. The question I started with was, did people eat meat? It's a very basic question. And the question I ended with was, how do you answer that question? Because it's actually really complicated. And who ate meat actually can mean a lot of different things. Who ate meat? When did they eat meat? Was it expensive? Was it difficult? Was it considered socially desirable? So, the simple question, who ate meat? I worked with the data that I had. And the data that I found, I was kind of an opportunist with this. I found different kinds of data, and each one answered the question in a different way. So from the original question, I branched out into different questions following what I could find. And the three main kinds of data that I could find were prices. This is mostly Japanese surveys that were conducted after World War One. Slaughterhouse surveys. These were the first data that I found on this topic, the ones that got me interested in this. I found these at Academia Sinica. They come from the 1930s when the Kuomintang government wanted to put 屠宰税, taxation on slaughter. So they went to the slaughterhouses in different cities and counted. They just counted. A lot of these are just numeric data. The third kind of data are household surveys. And these were done starting from universities, starting from Qilo Daxue, which is now Shandong Daxue, just asking, they literally told their students, go home and tell us what you eat. Tell us what your family eats. So people would keep a little notebook. And then it became more scientific as time went on, but household nutrition surveys. And so each of these types of data, prices, slaughterhouse data, and nutritional surveys, showed something different about meat eating,
So
which
it's
I could tell
quite
you right
fast.
now.
Okay, yeah, it's really fascinating that to what extent do you think your paper has um, accomplished what it sets out to do, and what is still waiting to be done? Do you think it will, at some point, you will have a
Hmm.
full view of the situation? Do people eat meat?
I think it's impossible to have a full view. I come from village studies. That was originally what I did, and when I did my doctoral research, I went out to a village and looked at religion. And the question that always comes up when you look closely at one place or one family or one region or whatever is, how typical is this? And what I found is there is no such thing as typical. So what really, I would say, uh, the 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 contribution of this paper is this dialogue between really close data, really specific targeted data, and the question of, what, if I know what's on my dinner table, what does that tell me about what my neighbors are having for dinner? If I know what they eat in Henan, what does that tell me about what they eat in Hebei? If I know what people eat in winter, what does it tell me about what they eat in summer? Um, and I think if there's one really big message to come out of this, is that all of these questions are really varied. They're intensely individualistic.
Okay, that's great. So, which sort of brings us to the second question. That is the most interesting detail that you encountered in when you're doing the research, or the detail that you addressed in your paper. What would that be?
I think it was exactly this variation. Um, Variation by place. So what I was expecting is sort of a generalized, maybe a North
Mm,
China model and a South China model, or a pastoral model and an agrarian model. This is very often how we think about China in these big generalizations. Um, and what I found, and this is mostly from the slaughterhouse data. Well, actually, no, all of the data, because the price data are really targeted to specific markets. The reason Japan was doing this is because they wanted to import things from China. And so they wanted to know which cities are producing what. They wanted to know, are there going to be rice riots, for example, in the Northeast, which is a place they already had a lot of interest. So they went to big markets. They also went to little markets. The same thing with the slaughterhouses. They went to, you know, big capital cities, but they also went to smaller cities like Zhangjiakou in the north of Hebei, which is a big sort of a clearinghouse market for livestock. It all comes in from Mongolia, goes to Zhangjiakou, gets resold, and then goes on to Beijing or Tianjin or whatever. Um, so those local pictures, what surprised at first, and then you start to see a logic in it, is how different everything is from each other. And some of these cities are actually close to each other. So, and I around easily, they should all be roughly the same price. If I buy a t-shirt now in Beijing, I buy a t-shirt in Tianjin, they're going to be the same price because moving things between Beijing and Tianjin is essentially cost free. One surprise that I had is going from a city to a dun to a small town. The cost of livestock, the cost of meat varies a lot. Going from a city like Jinan to Qingdao, and these are already connected by rail. They're very close to each other. The cost of cattle changes dramatically, and the reason is that the cattle are produced in Jinan and they're sold for export in Qingdao.
mhm,
So in between, there's a chance to make money doing what we call yufei, taking
mm,
thin cattle and feeding them so they get fat, so they're more expensive when you slaughter them. So value added. The same thing for taking cattle from, say, a place like Qinghai to um, somewhere like Dumadian, which is in Henan. It's another big clearinghouse for animals that are going to go on not necessarily to get slaughtered. Maybe they're going to go on to become gungyo. They're going to become work cattle. But all of these processes of moving animals from place to place, the difference in price is dramatic. But what that shows you is how animals move around, because every time there's a price difference, there's somebody making money on that price difference. So you see it, for example, with place to place, you see it with season to season. So animals in the winter cost different from animals in the summer because animals in the summer can go out and eat grass. Animals in the winter, if you don't kill them, you have to feed them. And so they become very cheap. And then we take things that we know about how people eat. We know that people eat more meat in the winter. And there's a cultural explanation because medicinally, meat is a warming food, especially mutton, especially beef. So you want to eat more meat during the winter. You don't want to eat meat in the summer. But one of the reasons is cultural. One of the reasons is just that all the slaughtering happens in the fall, so all the meat is really cheap in the winter. The same thing you could say for households. Uh, there's no such thing as a typical household, just like there is now. The way I eat and the way my neighbors eat is going to be different because my neighbors have 3 kids, or my other neighbors are 80 years old and they don't have any kids. So, different households, the same household at different points in their life cycle, they're going to eat differently because they have different needs. So, all of this detail, when you look at it really, really closely, it makes perfect sense. But if you don't have the detail, I think there's a tendency to want to make to want to fill in the detail with assumptions, and those assumptions sometimes just our imagination.
That's really fascinating to hear you spell out some of the details because as anthropologists, I am trained as an anthropologist. We prefer the cultural
Mhm.
explanations, and that's why we look for cultural explanations. But if you
Mm,
return to this phenomena of eating meat, or even just why we eat what we eat, it's a complex phenomena, and there is no single explanation for anything like that. So it's almost like an
mm.
assemblage of all sorts of factors creating this kind of phenomena of eating. So yeah, that's definitely something I personally learn a lot as a cultural anthropologist. So what would you say would be the implications of your paper for other researchers who come from supposedly different disciplinary background, but also working on modern or contemporary Chinese foodways, or just foodways in general?
I think on the one hand, we have the cultural explanations that we would see in anthropology.
Mhm.
On the other, for me, the conversation partner, let's put it that way, is economic historians, and they have a lot to say about food. They're very numbers driven, and this is a very numbers driven paper, but it's a different way of using numbers. There's no statistical analysis, there's no regression analysis. Simply looking at the numbers and asking qualitatively, what does it mean? There has been a lot to say about diet in China, particularly from the economic historians who are responding to the Great Divergence, the work of Ken Pomerantz, uh, answering questions like what was the average household in Jiangnan in terms of material well-being, material culture? How did they, for example, in the Mid-Qing dynasty, how did Jiangnan compare to, say, England? And so there's a lot of emphasis put on looking for benchmarks. For example, how many calories did the household eat? And how much of this and that material did the average household consume? And these are worthwhile things to do. But I find it to be deterministic to start from these numbers and then try to fill in culture from them. So, for example, if we say what was the average caloric consumption in, say, somewhere like Jiangnan, that does not tell you about the spread between households. It doesn't tell you about how people are consuming calories. So, for example, a lot of the literature you would see from the 1920s, people like R.H. Tawney would give you the image that people did not consume animals because they raised the animals, then they sold them, then they took the grain home. So they didn't eat animals because they were poor. Now, for a lot of people, that may have been true, but it wasn't true for everyone. And the 1920s were not typical because the 1920s were really troubled time. There was war, there was famine, there were floods. So, what was true in the 1920s, we can't generalize. And I think what I want to do in speaking to the people like the economic historians is to make them aware of how things change, how quickly change happens, how individual these stories are, and then ask them to maybe look at their data in a different way.
Final question.
Hmm,
From what you just described, I noticed something very interesting that you are working with quantitative data, but not
hmm,
looking for the bigger picture because that's what usually statisticians try to do. They look at the
hmm,
big data, bigger picture, the greater trends, but you sort of use the quantitative resources, but in a very different way. So,
Mhm.
could you elaborate a little bit more on your approach to the data, and also as a qualitative researcher by training, how do you what kind of tips and suggestion do you have for ethnographers and historians trying to work with data like this?
I come from a background that interacts with quantitative
Okay.
data. I don't use it myself, but my advisor at UCLA, the kind of people that they worked with, there was a lot of conversation with quantitative data. But the first thing I would say is that I'm not competent to do things like regression analysis. So I did not even try. What I wanted to do was some basic expressions of understanding big regional trends. So, for example, I would try to arrange the data from north to south. But even then, I think the problem is that I spend a lot of time on farms. So I know that when you arrange the data north to south, it actually doesn't mean much. What things look like in the far northeast and what they look like in a place like Shanxi, they're very different. That's not a north-south difference. It's forest adjacent versus maybe more arid climate difference. So, trying to find these big trends, it, it would take an awful lot to do it because there are so many variables. They're so individual. And I think that was my response was really what historians do, what my kind of historians do, is we tell stories. And I tried to let the numbers tell a story in the end. That's really what we want to do. So I tried to, for example, one of the nutritional surveys comes from the mountains of Sichuan, a place called Songpan, where you have a lot of, it's dry, it's high elevation, it's adjacent to the high altitude pastures like you would have in a place like Qinghai. It connects to a Qinghai based trade network. It's half Tibetan, half Han, with a lot of Muslim influence as well. All of these things are going to make a very individual story. And so what I have is I have a village where they went and they said, "What do you eat?" And we counted the the amount of meat that families ate. So you could tell a little bit. For example, Muslims, generally speaking, ate more meat than Han. But the data size is so small. It's one village in this vast area. You really have to ask, is that what is that telling us? It's telling us one village. That's what it's telling us. Now, by the time you get to the 1950s, 60s, and later on, you have a lot more data coming out from a national scale. Those you can work with, I think, with more questions of what's typical. Because then instead of one data point from Western Sichuan, you've got maybe 1,000 data points. Okay, now we can really do a more quantitative analysis and let a qualitative picture come out of that. But for what I had for the Republican period, and again, nobody has really done this for the Republican period. Um, I think what I wanted to do was to let all of these different factors, place is one, season is one, household is one, let each of them tell their own story and make it a qualitative story that comes out of quantitative data, that comes out of numbers. That
That's
was my
great.
goal.
That's quite inspirational because I like to tell stories, but only with qualitative data so far.
Mhm.
Your paper really showed us it's possible to tell the stories we're used to tell, but from a different set of data, and also very effectively paint a sort of interesting picture about a historical period. And that's really fascinating. That's what, by the way, what I like the most about your paper is just this kind of novel methodology. And yeah, I think it has a lot of prospect down the road for other researchers to take up.
Thank you.